I'm sitting over here to discuss something that is kind of interesting. And when I say interesting, there should be a very large asterisk on that, because when I say this is interesting, it usually isn't. The topic of today's video is going to go over my experience shooting with one of the oldest cameras that I've ever shot with, which is kind of an interesting thing, because I feel like I shoot with a variety of cameras, and I shoot typically with stuff that kind of came out in like 70s, 80s era, 60s. This came out in 1954, which doesn't seem like that much of a difference, but when I show you the camera, I think you'll agree it's very different from what we're kind of used to. And it is, of course, the Asahiflex 2B. Now, it's the 2 because I said so, but it's also the 2 because it has the 2 flash sync ports right there in the top, and based on the limited information I was able to find online about this, and not because there's not a lot of information, just because my research ability was greatly limited by my desire to not want to do any research for this video. So this is the world's first SLR with a returning mirror. So typically in other SLR models, when you would fire it, the mirror would sit up, and then when you advance, the mirror would drop. But this returns regardless of if the shutter is charged or not. So that's pretty neat. That's a helpful feature. Where this differs is that a lot of other Japanese companies at the time were kind of mimicking the German rangefinder designs. This mimicked a much earlier German model of camera, one that features a waist level viewfinder and this small kind of framing window over here. It's a uncoupled rangefinder, but not even really a rangefinder. It's literally just a little glass window, so you can kind of see what might potentially be in frame. And I shot with this camera, and I gotta say a couple of things. I love it, first of all. Like, I am very enthused with every part of this camera. This is the second of the Asahiflex line, then later become Pentax, as you can tell by the Asahi Optical Company logo there. And then also on the back here, I think right there, you can see the leatherette has the Asahi Optical Company engraved into the leatherette. So why am I talking about this camera? A number of reasons. One being that I had a lot of Pentax videos planned for the summer, so we're doing that. Secondly, I think it's important to discuss the roots of a particular brand, I think, and a brand that I really enjoy a lot of their products, which is Pentax. I feel like a lot of their cameras are pretty good, and when I say pretty good, I mean just that, pretty good. Like, very rarely has my mind been just blown by a Pentax. Like, it's very rare that happens, or I'm like, wow, this is game changing. But I'm always like very pleasantly surprised, and they're in the consistency of quality and in the consistency in performance, and just they seem to always kind of work, bar a few examples, but for the most part, Pentax cameras should always kind of seem to work. In this day and age, with how old these cameras are, that is kind of surprising. So when I say like they're just good cameras, I mean that they're just good cameras. I don't feel too shocked one way or another when I go to pick up a K1000, because I know what it feels like to shoot one. And again, barring a few examples, they're all pretty much the same, which is nice. I know pretty much everything there is to know about a Spotmatic, and that's a very nice feeling to have. And with this 2B, I feel very similarly, even though it's a camera that I've never really seen and never really shot before. There's a few through lines in this system that carry on in other models. For instance, this front plate here is very reminiscent to the S1, S2, S3 series of cameras, which was like right before the Spotmatic. It had a very similar front plate which is one of my favorite looks of all time. I think it kind of minimizes the amount of this leatherette that's required, and just that kind of like two-tone look, I think really lends itself well overall. The waist level viewfinder is a really nice feature. More than anything, it's coupled with this really helpful magnifying function there, so you can get really sharp focus. I was able to like nail focus on pretty much all of the images I took, which was really nice. I shot with it in a variety of environments, different shutter speeds, and so on and so forth, and it really performed quite adequately. I have no complaints really. The only thing I'm not a huge fan of, which is kind of how I feel about all cameras of this era, is the advance kind of sucks. It's like one of those little dials. You don't have the advance lever, which kind of minimizes the amount of movement because it's one big throw. This is just a little bit more of a cranking thing, similar to like the Leica 3F, 3G, whatever, the series of screw mount Leicas at the time, which is fine. It's not really for me. I feel like it really slows down the process, but I think if you get good at it, it makes it a little bit easier. Again, I've said this a few times, but as a tall person, it is nice having the waist level viewfinder because it gives me a chance to have a different perspective on photos. Whereas I feel like a lot of the times, depending on where my subject is at, I'm kind of shooting down on them a little bit. This kind of gives a little bit more of a lower angle. And on top of that too, when I'm in like crowded environments and stuff, and I bring a camera up to my eye because, and maybe this is just my perception, but because I'm so much taller, anything I do feels like it kind of commands a little bit more attention, you know, because my movements are more, like it takes more, like there's more distance my arm has to travel, it takes more time, there's more weight being thrown around, so to speak, but like that movement alone kind of draws people's attention, or they're like, what's that big guy doing? Whoa, whoa, big fella, you know, fucking hold your horses, guy, you know, like what I mean? It's just, it feels a little bit more like of a thing, and I don't want it to be, because like I want people's just natural interactions with stuff. So something like this, it's a little bit more subdued. It's so quiet too, shooting with it's just like, it's like wind whispering through the breeze. Like it's a really subtle and really nice experience. When I'm shooting with something like this, or with something like the Spotmatic, or with something like an MX, or even the K1000 to extent, it's like I've shot with this camera and I don't really feel the need to shoot with another camera, if that makes sense. Like when I'm using this, I feel this like strong desire to just get good at shooting with this particular platform. And I don't want, and maybe that's just where I'm at in the stage of buying and selling cameras, but like shooting with this, I don't want any other cameras. I don't want anything else. Like I'm perfectly content with this camera. It's something I can really hone in on and focus with. That might just be where I'm at in like the greater lifespan of my film photography journey. And I hate to keep kind of bringing this up because I feel like there's a few factors, and at some point I do need to write this down and like really make a standardized kind of testing rubric of where I rate these things and like what I prefer. But this to me feels like a really good travel camera system because it's reliable, doesn't require any batteries. I think that it's subdued enough that you're not drawing too much attention to yourself. How do I rate this in cameras? Because it's not fair to compare this to something like the EOS 850, okay, where it's just literally point, shoot, fucking don't worry about it sort of situation. It is so much its own thing, and it maybe is fair to compare it to something like an MX or a Spotmatic or something like that. But even then, I wouldn't think that that's a very apt comparison because those things have light meters, different lenses that you can use. There are different lenses for this, but it's a 33 or 36 millimeter mount. So it's smaller than the 39 millimeter mount on Leica, which means you really can't adapt much of anything to this. And there's only, I think, 4 or 5 different lenses that they really made for it. And really, unless you are willing to pony up a bunch of money, the 53.5 is pretty much what you're going to get. So for all intents and purposes, It's a fixed lens, so it doesn't really compare to those things too much. Waist level viewfinder. It's so much its own unique unicorn to that extent that I don't really know how I would say like it's better or worse than this, because it's just different. Like, it's hard to compare them. But I would say from my experiences lately with cameras, at the time I was shooting with a T70 and a Minolta SRT, I think it was the 201, Nikon F3, MX, Spotmatic. What else was I shooting with? The Mamiya C330. But ultimately, I think this has probably been my favorite for a while. It does a lot for me in terms of what it brings to the table. It's simple. It's easy to work on if it breaks. The mechanisms are all perfectly functional for it being 70 years old. I think that's amazing. The focusing system is great. It's subtle. It's compact. It's reliable, beautiful to look at, I think. Even if you're not shooting film on it, just setting it up on a shelf, it is the perfect representation of what a film camera should be, in my opinion. And I'm overall very grateful that Pentax then went on to release other cameras, but truthfully, this is one of my favorite cameras of theirs that I've shot with. The fact that it's also one of their first cameras, I think, is pretty phenomenal overall. So, long ass introduction over. That's the Asahiflex 2B. I absolutely enjoyed it a lot. Thank you very much for watching. Appreciate it as always. Like the video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you on the next one.